So that explains a lot about the parasocial left. What about MAGA communism?
I guess it was about COVID and the collapse of the Bernie Sanders movement. Once Sanders was kneecapped by the mainstream liberals, I think what we saw, Riyadh, was an intensification of Zoomers entering into these parasocial communities and then experimenting with ideologies on the left and concocting some really bizarre ideologies.
Like MAGA communism.
Like MAGA communism.
So just run us through, what does that even mean? Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh Larian, Editor-in-Chief of Muftah magazine, and I'm joined for this episode by my co-host and Muftah managing editor, Mohammed Sayed Bushra. Last Thursday, we spoke with Daniel Tutt, a philosopher, writer, and host of the Emancipations podcast. He was educated at American University and the European Graduate School and has taught philosophy at several institutions, including the George Washington University, Marymount University, and even the DC jail. Tutt's intellectual trajectory is somewhat peculiar. Raised in a working-class family and shaped by experiences of labor and estrangement, he first discovered philosophy through poetry before encountering the existential force of Nietzsche. Over time, his thinking shifted toward Marx and psychoanalysis as tools for understanding the political moment we inhabit. His journey has taken him from construction sites to lecture halls, from grassroots activism in DC to the study of philosophy and psychoanalysis across the US and Europe. He's a fascinating figure and a serious mind. We had two goals in asking him to join us here on Protean View. First, to discuss a recent article he published with Muftah titled Loser Politics, which appeared in our December issue, Misfits. And second, to dive into his new book on Nietzsche, titled How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche, which was published last year in January 2024. In a way, the argument in his article is continuous with the argument in the book. They both address how Nietzsche's thought has shaped the language of our politics, including the seemingly unavoidable winner-loser framework that Tutt suggests we're trapped in. As you'll hear in just a moment, we address why Nietzsche remains so important in our time and how in so many ways his thought presents an obstacle to the development of a real working-class movement interested in defying the strictures of the winner-loser binary. But before we get there, I want to take a moment to say just how important your support is to this podcast. To those who already support us on Patreon, thank you for helping make this episode possible. If you haven't already joined Protean View as a supporter on Patreon, you can do so for as little as $5 a month. With your $5 monthly contribution, you get a free subscription to Muftah magazine, and if you'd like to upgrade your monthly support, you can receive a number of additional benefits, including a custom mug, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, an invitation to our Discord server, and even an ability to select our next guest on the show and what questions we ask them. If that sounds good to you, visit us at patreon.com/proteanview. You can also find out more on our website, muftah.org/protean-view. Thanks for listening and for your support. This is Protean View. So, Daniel, you published this article with Muftah last December, Loser Politics, and it caused a serious stir and a number of responses online. So why don't you run us through the basic argument in that article and tell us why you think it elicited such a turbulent, let's say, reaction.
Thanks, Riyadh, and good to be with you. Nice to see you as well, Mohammed. I think sort of part of the origin of the idea of loser politics was this notion that in liberal society, liberal ideology as a political ideology sort of accepts capitalism on its own terms. You know, maybe it has a sort of reformist agenda, maybe it's pro-welfare state, but most of the neoliberal versions of liberalism are pretty content with, a basic kind of libertarian approach to the free market. And the free market ends up kind of becoming a mirror of civil society, especially the internet. And especially the internet under, say, Elon Musk's control, right? Which is a sort of cutthroat environment. And so this idea of a winner-loser society is sort of internalized. It's internalized, especially in an American context. And it becomes a kind of political mythology, right? So one of my arguments in loser politics is, if you look at the Jordan Peterson community, or Jordan Peterson as a public intellectual, and he had a famous debate with left-wing Marxist philosopher or post-Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek a few years ago. And I was interested in that debate, and I watched it very carefully, in part because I'm a student of Žižek, but also because Žižek said something interesting to me, which is he said he wants to take the audience of Peterson away from Peterson. Now, who's the audience? Well, the audience, according to the liberal sort of orientation, sort of, the basement-dwelling incel loser. So first and foremost, what I think the article was controversial, Riyadh, is precisely because I was trying to both denounce the mere idea that this winner-loser mythology is valid, as a valid way to categorize people, while also giving credence to the fact that conservative communities organize according to that logic. In other words, Jordan Peterson accepts a worldview of winners and losers, and he tries to argue that liberalism doesn't allow the loser to be victorious. They're held down. They're held down by various, forms of DEI or forms of liberal ideology that are sort of too soft. So the idea of Peterson's community is sort of like, we need to rise above. It's a very Nietzschean idea, actually. So I connect it to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is actually, incidentally, a very important thinker for Peterson. And in Nietzsche's philosophy, incidentally, I recently wrote a book on Nietzsche. This is a big idea, which is the forces of the left, primarily socialism for Nietzsche, not really liberalism, have actually created a situation in which they are obscuring what Nietzsche saw as a natural difference between winners and losers in society. So Nietzsche wants to valorize that difference. And he actually wants to create what he calls an Übermensch, a kind of higher man that will transcend the left's forces of egalitarianism, forces of socialism, suppress. They sort of create an upside down world. And so ultimately the loser in liberalism's eyes is really the winner. And that's kind of like Peterson's message, which is like the society is lying to you. You need to garner the wherewithal. This kind of bootstrap ideology becomes the main idea to transcend what liberalism is telling you. So it's very interesting, right? It's sort of this like entangled political mythology. And so like both sides are wrong. And I think I hit some nerves with this idea. And ultimately I'm making a connection between this idea and a new form of what I call parasocial internet organizations on the American left that are kind of taking this same approach that Jordan Peterson takes, this kind of Nietzschean approach. And as a man of the left myself, as a socialist, I was compelled to criticize that because I find it problematic.
Just for clarification, your argument about the winner-loser dichotomy, you're saying that both conservatives and liberals perpetuate this binary. And for you, it's a consequence of living in a market-driven society and abiding by the logics of that market-driven society, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's also, it's an inescapable fact of living in a capitalist society. And what I'm trying to say is that communities form in protest against it. Because we live in a deeply sort of unjust and unfair and kind of, like we say that we live in a meritocratic sort of hyper-modern liberal society, but for the vast majority of people, the world doesn't feel meritocratic, right?
Right.
And so political communities form in protest to that fact, right? As a way to provide the members of the community a way to simulate a world, right, that is alternative to the mainstream world. And so that's kind of the heart of my idea of the parasocial. That's how the parasocial connects. And I work with the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, and he has this very interesting idea in his book called Experiences in Groups, where he says, look, the logic of a group in capitalist society is the feeling. People are drawn to groups. They identify with groups because they are fleeing a sense of persecution. And then he gives a sort of taxonomy of different types of groups. And the one type of group that I found very similar to this Nietzschean Peterson, or even the mega communist, which I think is very similar, which was the focus of my essay, is what he calls the fight or flight group. And the fight or flight group is interesting because it's formed around one leader, and the one leader becomes this sort of paragon for the definition of success and for the definition of winning against an unfair world. But the problem with the fight or flight group is that all of the other members don't get a chance for themselves to be winners. So they sort of simulate victory through the performance of the one at the top. And usually that takes on a patriarchal form, right? There's very few sort of feminine communities that reproduce that logic, if any, right? Which I find to be a problem. But also it simulates a certain violence because hostile figures can only prove themselves through contesting the one leader. And so it creates a certain repression internal to the group. And that has a consequence, according to this psychoanalyst, Wilfred Bion, who's a really interesting guy, by the way. He was a psychoanalyst, in the Freudian tradition. But during World War II, he took his notions of group theory and he advised the British military in fighting the Nazis. So he has a very sort of robust and clear, he's a very clear writer. So I sort of made that connection as well, right? Which is what we need to be careful of as political communities. First and foremost, it's very healthy to reject the winner-loser mythology. I will be the first to admit it, which I think it is a task of socialism to reject it.
But can I just interject here and ask?
Please.
Can I just ask here, how exactly do you reject it? Because if what you're saying here is that the winner-loser mentality, dichotomy, binary is an inevitable consequence of the capitalist system and the moment we live in, the political moment we live in, it sounds to me that you're saying we're kind of trapped in this moment. We're trapped in the system. But you're also suggesting we have to think about transcending the limits of this binary. What's the way out here?
Well, I think the internet, for example, and YouTube is a way out. But there's different ways to organize your discontent. So everyone, a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people have a profound discontent over the fact that let's say their career path is not challenging to them. So what I've been observing through looking at the political economy of contemporary capitalism in America is that a lot of young people have what we call elite overproduction, right? So they're highly educated, but the job market is dismal. And when they enter into that job market, the opportunities don't have a kind of commensurability to their training. And so what ends up happening is they need an outlet to exhibit their learning, their skills. Right? All of this is sort of kept inside. And so what we're seeing with the collapse also concurrent to that of left-wing institutions on a large scale, labor unions, socialist organizations, the Democratic Party really has abandoned all of the core principles of the left for the most part, is we're seeing very interesting parasocial internet communities form. And they are doing politics online. They're doing political education online. They're doing YouTube videos, podcasts online. I'm for all of that. I was just trying to say that when we do that, we need to be, I think, extra careful not to kind of construct these communities structured on this fight or flight thing where it's kind of this exclusive leadership structure and that ultimately reproduces a kind of, because, mega communism, which we've kind of hinted at here, becomes my paradigm example of this nostalgic communist movement that's sort of conflating a desire for a return to a more traditional American patriarchy and a more traditional American culture in which fairness and meritocracy was more transparent and more available, which is very much in line with Donald Trump's whole victory the second time around. But they're using this sort of signifiers and the symbols of communism, right? And we can get into why they argue that there must be a fusion between mega and communism in a moment. But what I'm trying to say is like, there's good ways to do internet political education, and there's not good ways. And so I think, to go back to your first question, Riyadh, that might be the reason the piece was so, had such passionate response, because I was just sort of saying, I was sort of identifying a symptom of our moment, which is like the collapse in the legitimacy of liberal institutions has given rise to internet actors that are independent. They don't have much money. All they have is like their ideas and their charisma. That's all the sort of social capital that they have. So I actually think that's interesting. Like, I actually think that's, and they themselves become a market site for competition amongst themselves, right? So there's downsides, but there's also upsides to it. I I think it would be too elitist to just reject all of it.
So just to understand what you're saying here, you're not saying that the internet has somehow escaped the trap of the capitalist system, that it's somehow not under the spell of capitalist logic. You're just saying that there are cracks in the internet, there are spaces in the internet that allow people to sort of explore alternatives in a subversive way. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. I mean, I think that's right. I think,
And then on that
yes.
note, if I can just add just a question here. So
Please.
You talked about the parasocial left as being sort of an example of a community that's trying to do this. So first of all, what does parasocial mean? And why the left specifically?
Right. So parasocial refers to a type of social bond, a social connection, which is mediated through the virtual sphere, and which has a different level of commitment, responsibility, and engagement than sort of like your traditional civil society bonds that you would form through, I don't know, playing sports on a team or being a part of a party or doing something in physicality, right, in the physical world. So therefore, it has the kind of informal, disengaged, playful spirit of the internet, which we're all familiar with, cat videos and a lot of fluff and a lot of silliness and jokes and memes. Has that. But it also has another dimension, which is a learning and pedagogical dimension formed around leaders that people identify with, especially young people, that can be quite passionate, right? So in religious communities, we know what that looks like, and I'm sure you guys have analyzed and examined some of those types of activities in the Muslim space. What interests me as a socialist is how the decline in actual socialist institutions is leading to internet socialism. And the way that's playing out is usually around podcast personalities through like a Patreon community, a Discord community. Sometimes it's connected to a party, but one of the struggles, because liberalism is so dominant in the wider ecosystem of socialism, parasocial internet communities that are disconnected from actual existing left-wing institutions tend to have more success because their legitimacy is not thrown into question. Because anyone that aligns with liberalism right now has a legitimacy crisis. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of strange, right? It's sort of like freelance internet gurus, pseudo-intellectuals, in some cases real intellectuals. By real, I mean trained, some untrained, varying levels, are forging these communities. And Jordan Peterson is kind of like the old template for how to do that. But now there are literally dozens of people like that, okay? And they are in conflict with each other. Sometimes they're in harmony with each other. It really varies. It takes on kind of like a spat drama, right? So there's all of these like dramas, and it's very personality. It's cult of personality,
So that explains a lot about the parasocial left. What about MAGA communism? I mean, you talk about MAGA communism in the article. What's the significance there?
I guess it was about COVID and the collapse of the Bernie Sanders movement in 2019, 2020, where we witnessed, for the Zoomers, in particular. So these are people, in their early 30s and below, early 30s to teens and late 20s. I'm a millennial myself, so this is like the generation that precedes me. They were, according to public polling, some of the most passionate supporters of Bernie Sanders. And, Bernie Sanders' kind of class-first universalism really appealed to young people, which is an interesting dynamic we can talk about. But once Sanders was kneecapped by the mainstream liberals, I think what we saw, Riyadh, was an intensification of Zoomers entering into these parasocial communities and then experimenting with ideologies on the left and concocting some really bizarre ideologies.
Like mega communism. So just run us through, what does that even mean? MAGA communism. I don't think people really know.
Are you familiar with the concept of hyperstition?
No, not necessarily. What's hyperstition?
Okay. Hyperstition is this idea that emerges out of this CCRU British think tank, I think in the 80s and 90s. And it kind of refers to this idea of an early internet concept whereby an internet meme could be thought of as catalytic, as causally responsible for political consciousness in a real robust sense. And with this idea of hyperstition, a lot of internet and media philosophers that lead these groups, that's how they think of their task, which is our metric of success will come through how we are known in the wider culture. And so that invites these communities to sort of exaggerate and create grandiose memes, quite literally memes, but a meme, I don't mean a meme as like just a one-off image. I mean a meme as a sort of confluence, a concept that will pervert and stick within the culture and force people to question the meme itself. So I mean it in a bigger sense. And you could think about this as the site of battle, right? So these communities form different concepts and they stake down memes as like an identity marker for themselves, right? And so it's that in the mega communist case, what they're trying to do is argue that in the American political scene, the base of Donald Trump's movement is the site of the old working class. And so they think that from a Marxist standpoint, the most vital political agitation is located in Donald Trump's base. And they call that the partisan, okay? And I quote this in my piece, right, from their manifesto. And so they take this Hegelian idea of dialectics, where Hegel had this idea that you can read social reality as a unity of opposites. And they think that if we stoke this base enough and we show a disconnect, right, a corruption internal to, if we break the core of the mega base, we can show that ultimately, because most of them have, some working class background, at least empirically, okay? That's a big debate, actually. People are not clear on the class composition of Trumpism. So, but anyways, according to these guys, that's what they want to do, is they want to split mega base and turn it into a Marxist thing. And they faced a lot of criticism, including from myself, because I went and I debated their founder in a YouTube video, which I can tell you about. But that's the basic idea, They want to, and many of them are from families in America that are pro-MAGA. So there's also that kind of psychoanalytic dimension, is they're sort of also trying to repair perhaps something with their family in a weird way, right? So, and I myself have a family that is MAGA. And so when I saw this whole thing happening, Riyadh, I was sort of concerned about it in a genuine, like, socialist way. Like, what are you guys doing, right? Because there was a lot of stuff that was also, like, extremely transphobic, but in a way which was excessive, right? And I know how liberals manipulate things like the trans community. Like we saw, it was released in Bangladesh, USAID. Even conservative politicians were supporting the mobilization of trans community for regime change in Bangladesh. So I know that the trans community is abused from a lot of different ways. But what I was seeing, these memes, the mega communists on the trans stuff was way above the grade of what's appropriate, calling for violence and stuff like that. So I was compelled, for a lot of reasons, to engage these guys. Yeah.
And on this note, you talk in the article about the politics of resentment, and Nietzsche comes up here, right? You touched on this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but do you want to expand on this a little bit? Tell us, what is the politics of resentment?
Yes. So Nietzsche has this idea of ressentiment. It's a French, it's like, ressentiment is this French term that Nietzsche, one of his most important concepts. And it's a very interesting idea that Nietzsche concocts, which is that he believes that societies that are structured around the maxim of equality, okay, equal rights for all, will be resentful societies. That they will, he argues in strong terms, that they will produce cycles of ressentiment, or we can just use the word resentment. It's a little pretentious to always use that word. So he diagnoses how liberalism creates resentful societies. Okay, that's very interesting. He analyzes that psychologically, philosophically, politically. Now, I come at it a little differently than Nietzsche because I kind of look more at what Nietzsche's prescription for overcoming resentment is. And what I see Nietzsche as sort of advocating, and I write about this in one of my books, my recent books, is this idea that, well, the lower classes need to basically accept their lot in life. And he ends up effectively arguing, that the plebeian what we would today call the working class, should not be tempted with this idea of equality for all. They should really know their place. Ultimately, they should know their place. And liberalism does a sort of injustice by giving the mere pretense to equality.
And this is why I think you say Nietzsche is one of the most, in your words, one of the most important intellectual allies of the liberal order.
Well, that's right. I mean, in a certain way, he's an ally. Not for all liberals, let me be clear, not for all liberals, but he is if we analyze his own politics, which I think is, of course, different than his metaphysical work, so we shouldn't necessarily conflate the two. I mean, Nietzsche himself is very happy with liberalism on condition that liberalism will be able to pacify the masses. If liberalism is not capable of doing that, he will move away from liberalism. Okay, so there's a certain objective that Nietzsche has, which is to deal with the spirit of revenge. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one of his late works, Nietzsche also gives spiritual advice to his community, followers, his readers. And so he thinks that the spirit of revenge is actually locatable in the origin of philosophy itself, which is why if you read Nietzsche, you'll know that he believes that Socrates, one of the founders of Western philosophy, is the godfather of resentment. And so he concocts a genealogy of philosophers who are kind of preachers of resentment. Of course, also importantly, the Abrahamic religions are also doctrines of resentment, of ressentiment. Okay, so you see, Nietzsche casts a huge net, and it's so ubiquitous, resentment, that he says, only a few of you, to paraphrase, only a few of you will truly be capable of overcoming resentment, right? And so he sets it as a task. And that's why, Nietzsche is such a complex and interesting thinker, because, that prescription is actually quite spiritually sound. But his political prescription is not good for socialism, because I feel that ultimately what he's trying to do is take away that sense of struggle and antagonism over an unjust society amongst the lower class, right? He wants the lower class to be content and pacified. That's a problem for me.
I think we should. This is probably a good point to transition into the book. I'll let Hamid jump in here, but actually, before you jump into your questions, Muhammad, can you just say something, Daniel, about Nietzscheanism? What is Nietzscheanism? There's a quote here actually from your book, if I may read it. You say Nietzscheanism is not reducible to one sort of politics, whether that be fascist, liberal, or socialist. Rather, Nietzscheanism lives within the political spectrum, and when deployed, it functions to shut down egalitarian and emancipatory politics. So you touched on a little bit of this in your prior comments, but maybe just tell us a little more about what Nietzscheanism is here.
So there's really three seminal thinkers of modern life: Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. And so why Nietzsche? Well, Nietzsche is a seminal thinker because Nietzsche is a thinker who locates a sort of great, what he calls hermeneutics of suspicion. So Nietzsche detects kind of an operation of power within social life, and he has this sort of arsenal of concepts that help us sort of get to the deeper core and the deeper truth of the conundrum of modern existence. He's also, of course, one of the founders of modern existentialism. We wouldn't have the notion of personal values, right? We refer to our values if it weren't in part for Nietzsche. So one of the arguments that I make is that he is sort of a secular prophet. I mean, Muhammad Iqbal said he is some type of prophet, right? That he had some prophetic. And then Muhammad Iqbal said, well, if only I could tell him about Islam, maybe I could convert him to Islam. It's an interesting side point because a lot of Iqbal scholars say that that Iqbal himself was a kind of left-wing Nietzschean. So to answer that question is difficult because what I'm trying to say is like Nietzsche invents modern humans in a certain way, like this idea of Harold Bloom, the Shakespeare scholar, saying that Shakespeare is so profound that he sort of invents cultural archetypes. I'm kind of saying something like that, What I'm saying politically is that Nietzscheanism is, well, it started off as a movement of cults in Germany, the Nietzsche cults with Stefan George and other kind of avant-garde thinkers. And then what's curious about Nietzscheanism is that it spreads across the entire political spectrum. So even in Bolshevism in Russia, the 1917 socialist revolution, they had a Nietzschean cult. So that's a curious thing about Nietzsche. You don't have Marxist cults on the right. Like Marx is a leftist thinker, right? Nietzsche is both a leftist and a right thinker. And that's very, very unique. There's very few thinkers that can elevate to that level of influence. So that gives you hopefully a sense.
I think this is probably a good point for me to ask my question, or my first question anyway. So the title of your book is How to Read Like a Parasite. So the intriguing premise, as I understand it, is that in the reading of Nietzsche, the left has been insufficiently careful in recognizing and guarding against those elements of Nietzsche's philosophy that not only contradict leftist positions, but also threaten to inherently undermine them if carelessly internalized, as has happened during much of the 20th and 21st centuries. So you want to affirm that there are lessons that the left can learn from reading Nietzsche, but that they must do so as parasites. First, how does one determine the boundaries of what is inherently antithetical to the left and what is not? And then second, how might Muslims learn from this? Because I ask this because this is a problem that appears almost perennially for Muslims when there's a sense that XYZ author or even genre should not be engaged with or perhaps not even read because they fall too far outside the boundaries of what is kind of theologically compatible, and thus they threaten to somehow infect the reader.
Okay, very good. So, yes. So this idea of parasitical reading is kind of related first and foremost to Nietzsche's idea of how he wishes to organize his own community of readers, his own community of followers. And, there is a sort of elitism in Nietzsche that is old-fashioned. And what I mean by that is that Nietzsche sort of follows into this 19th century idea of rejecting the low-born philosopher. And he says a very classist argument. And as you may or may not remember, Muhammad, in the book, I introduce a bit of my biography as coming from a working class background. And there's a whiplash that occurs because when I read Nietzsche first, right, I didn't have access to Marxist interpretations of his work. So I didn't see the classist and elitist operation at work. In fact, I saw him more as a timeless philosopher, totally detethered from his political context. And therefore, I had no class consciousness, you could say, or class awareness. And then when I started to really dig into Nietzsche, I realized that, well, Nietzsche himself wants to sort of structure his community according to these class divisions. And he has this important idea of what he calls pathos of distance, which is this idea that superior and inferior specimens, individuals, need to come to a strong awareness of their differences. And so he ultimately produces this kind of like pro-segregative logic of his community. And so, the question becomes, well, what kind of damage has Nietzsche's elitism done to the left? And that becomes an interesting question. And it is bound up with the revolutionary tradition. So one of the ways that I really read Nietzsche is that he is responding to a very particular set of political events, revolving around the French Revolution and its aftermath. And the French Revolution was bringing into the world scene some basic principles of egalitarianism. You had, so say, for example, just a few years after Nietzsche is born in Germany, you have the struggle for male suffrage. You still had slavery, right? You had 1848, the worker uprising where Marx and Engels penned the Communist Manifesto. But you have this kind of confluence of egalitarian movements that Nietzsche sees himself as a prophet to combat, right? He sees himself as a prophet to combat them. Feminism, he's pro-slavery, he's pro-hierarchy. He's an aristocratic figure. But his aristocratism is much different than usual, say, Edward Burke style conservatism, which is nostalgic for the past. No, Nietzsche's like a futurist. Nietzsche wants to concoct a kind of destruction of modern liberal society to create a future society that will be pro-aristocratic. It's very ingenious. And when, I say this thing on Iqbal and prophecy, that's kind of what Nietzsche's wanting to do as well. So how does the left detect all of that? Well, part of it has to do with history. So part of it is sort of, if you read Nietzsche historically, you sort of get a better respect, I think, for our tradition. A lot of thinkers that we're very familiar with that are philosophers, because part of this is very interesting, Muhammad, which is after the Second World War, there were 10,000 pages of Nietzsche that has never been seen by anybody. This is what's called the Nachlass, the unpublished material. And these two Italians went into East Germany. It was actually managed by the communists, and they started to translate all of this material. And Foucault and Deleuze, these great French philosophers, were on the board of this translation process. And so a lot of these debates in French philosophy about the death of the author, for example, which you're probably familiar with, were inspired by their reading of Nietzsche's Nachlass. And they came up with these notions that Nietzsche is a decentered philosopher who transcends all of the names of history and that he therefore should be read as this prophet. It's totally decontextualized from his time. And so what my book was trying to do is sort of do the opposite of what they did. Like, what does it look like as an exercise of thinking about this figure when we historically situate him? And I suppose my conclusion is that it helps the left see these more traditional values to get back in touch with them. It's kind of like against postmodernism.
Which actually leads me to the next question, so it seems to me that like so much of what today is negatively associated with the left, almost by definition, so including irrationalist perspectivism, atomistic standpoint epistemology, anti-foundationalism, postmodernism, more generally, are things that you might argue are in fact, part of this Nietzschean inheritance on the left, almost attempting to kind of shift it towards a more liberal position, if anything. So how is it that these things came to be so closely identified with the left? And how would you reassure someone who is suspicious of the left because of these associations?
It's a very difficult question to ask how they became associated with the left. Part of this has to do with the traditional left, in a Marxist and socialist sense, found its universalism in working class struggle. They had a kind of critique of capitalism at a bread and butter level, and they had this class analysis. One of the things that Nietzscheanism has done to the left is sort of excise that class analysis. So that's one problem. He's not, of course, solely responsible for that. There's many other factors. There's this thing called, the new left, the rise of the new social movements. You have May 68, this very important uprising in 68, where they were saying, well, the traditional working class is kind of reactionary. We need to actually think of a different revolutionary subject, right? And I think that in that way, the left has been caught in a kind of 60s, Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone? They're kind of like, they can't get out of the 60s in some ways. And I think that, part of what I'm trying to do is say, well, let's open up our history and let's sort of have a broader approach. And that, the postmodern turn has some strengths. I mean, Nietzsche's notion of perspectivism, this idea that every community does not have a sort of hegemonic hold on the truth, is a very, very powerful notion, but it also leads to a type of violent relativism and nihilism, which, by the way, he himself was familiar with, right? So Nietzsche is such a vast thinker that he identifies problems which he also tries to give solutions to, right? That's why he is an eminently political thinker. And that is also why a lot of American, what they call analytic Nietzscheans, they have a policy. It's a very curious policy, Muhammad, in their interpretation of him. Say Mortimer Clark or Brian Leader, two very prominent analytic Nietzscheans. They don't consider his unpublished material. They say, no, we only analyze him from his published, right? So that's another thing that I choose to do, is sort of open it up. Like, I think all of it should be considered. How did Nietzsche's letters to all of it needs to be considered to give a fuller appraisal. So it's a side point, but I don't know how to answer this question. I would just say that many on the left want to overcome the postmodernist trap, and we see it as limited, and we're trying to overcome it.
So I wanted to move on to something else. Before I ask any further questions about it, I wanted to ask about a key distinction you present in the book between realism and nominalism. So could you please talk our audience through the questions briefly? First, what are realism and nominalism, both in general and in the specific relevant sense of political epistemology? And then second, why is this distinction important for understanding Nietzsche's project? Briefly, so that we can follow it up.
Okay, I'll do my best to be brief. Yeah, it's a philosophical debate that goes back to the Middle Ages, even before, and Neoplatonism. Has to do with epistemology. So what is epistemology but the philosophical investigation into how we make truth claims and how we verify them? And this also exists in the field of politics, right? So take the French Revolution just as a case study. So how is it that we understand the masses in revolt in the French Revolution when they utter a demand for equality? We demand equality. And they seemingly do so spontaneously. But through that seeming spontaneity, what subsequently happens is institutions grow to represent that demand. Then the question for political philosophers becomes, well, what's the basis of that truth claim? Is it merely a kind of nominalist? Is it all purely relative? Or is there a realist dimension? Does it actually tap into a universal dimension of a wider unfinished universal project? And that debate split socialists and liberals in the 19th century, with socialists on the realist side and liberals on the nominalist side. And what I argue is that capitalism itself presents liberals, it makes liberals nominalists. That's kind of a funny way to say it, but liberals are uneasy with universalism, right? They much prefer a public sphere that's guided by sort of relativistic perspectival communities, where each can kind of negotiate out its truth, but never arrive at something higher. And socialism wants to affirm that there are class forces that are driving at a real dimension. So that's the distinction. And what I try to show is that, we can think modern politics along similar lines, and that there actually is a way to concoct something like universalism in modern political life, right? And Nietzsche, by the way, is a figure of a profound. I call him a hyper-nominalist, because he's aware of this liberal fear of realism. He's also fearful of it, but he creates. He's more cunning than liberals. He creates ways to cut down the roots of realism, right? Ultimately, by attacking the intellectuals that stand for realism.
So a nominalist in political epistemology, according to you, and I'm quoting from the book, can be understood as one who refuses the fuller achievement of universal values that undergird democratic demands. So, whereas the political realist takes democratic values such as liberty, fraternity, equality to be universal truths that we should strive to achieve, the political nominalist would deny their universal validity, perhaps sequestering them to one sphere. Now, I wanted to get your perspective on this. There's a self-proclaimed traditionalist orientation within contemporary Islam that places much importance on its claim to champion a realist epistemology. In fact, it goes to great lengths to frame its disagreement with other Muslims, including other major scholars of the past, as a disagreement over this question of realism and nominalism. Thus, they denounce Ibn Taymiyyah for his nominalism, and they even frame Satan, or Iblis, as a nominalist. However, at the very same time, this traditionalist orientation is very committed to an aristocratic vision of politics, much akin to Nietzsche's, and in stark contrast to what Professor Aymer Anjam described as Ibn Taymiyyah's ummatic or umma-centric or even democratic vision of politics. I think if pressed, these traditionalists might in fact justify their aristocratic vision precisely on the basis of their commitment to realism. Their vision of realist politics is not one in which liberty, equality, fraternity are universal truths, but rather rank, order, and hierarchy is what is true and real and universal. So how might we understand this in light of your argument?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, because it seems as if you're suggesting that internal to the debates amongst Muslim intellectuals, it's the reverse of what I'm suggesting between liberals and socialists. And I suppose that's very compelling, because I think that part of what this has to do with is the specificity of the post-1848 milieu as composing this kind of three-part system of society, right? Sort of the sphere of liberty, freedom, and equality. So market, state, and fraternity, civil society. And the idea of realism would be that there's a sort of mediation between the three, and there is also a kind of telos. This notion of telos or teleology, this idea that history has some there's a purposive dimension to historical becoming and historical events, which is, of course, a claim that Nietzsche strongly rejects. But what I argue is that in the Marxist and Hegelian tradition, we have something like a teleology. There is some type of claim that a communist society, or that a society beyond capitalism, is a part of the realist demands of the masses. So the masses, the oppressed, are the agents who possess this realist demand. So perhaps, Mohammed, the question would be, because I know that a lot of it is based on a theodicy, which Marxism also would reject. So if Marxism is a secular system of thought based on a a kind of materialist and immanent theology of the becoming of of the overcoming of the capitalist system as something which we see as a necessity. The question is sort of what agency will be responsible for that overcoming and creating a higher world, a better world. There's been a lot of debate within Marxism about whether Marx maintains his teleological vision of capitalism or not. Say, for example, we have this movement called degrowth communism. Kaihi Seito, the Japanese Marxist thinker, for example, is arguing that in the late Marx, he abandons teleology in favor of what he calls degrowth communism, which is basically this idea that, okay, if you have a teleological Marxism of a purposive, realist-oriented overcoming, that's all based on like a logic of understanding the system as a productive system, that the proletariat would seize that productive system and send it in a better direction. And Saito says, well, no, Marx basically envisioned that capitalism will not be overcome that way. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that whole argument, but I think that perhaps it's difficult to pose this rapprochement between political epistemologies, in part because one of them, the Marxist, is fully enmeshed in this metabolic system, capitalist system, which it sees as sort of caught up in some type of inevitable decline and overcoming of itself, right? There's a great book or a great essay by Gramsci where he wrote that the Bolsheviks, 1917, was a revolution against capital. He called it the revolution. What he meant by that was that this purposive vision of overcoming capitalism, which is articulated in Marx's Capital, well, he argues that the Russian Revolution disproved that, and that rather the Russian Revolution showed that the system was overcome by the voluntary will and power of the vanguard class. Not only the working class. The Bolsheviks had an alliance between the peasantry, bourgeois intellectuals, and the working class, right? They were like strategists of revolution at a high level. So what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to think of a way to link this, because I know also you have Asherite metaphysics, which would be realist in this analysis, whereas Timean metaphysics would be, or epistemology rather, would be nominalist.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that is your contention would be, if we transpose that into my domain of thought, well, it's actually the nominalists who are more on the side of emancipation of the community. Why? Let me ask you, why would that be?
Just hearing you speak made me think, I'm wondering whether the content of the realist epistemology is determined by the direction of the teleology. Because what you're saying is that because the teleology in the kind of materialist, overcoming of capitalism and so on, is progressive, whereas I think the teleology according to these realists we are speaking about, as you said, in kind of Asherite metaphysics, are committed to a teleology of decline. So they have to look back and to restore some order, which is kind of this hierarchy and aristocracy and whatever else. So I'm wondering whether that might be it.
That is fascinating. No, absolutely. And I think that we will have to have many hookah sessions when you come back to Washington, D.C. on this precise matter, because it's a very, very compelling question. And I this distinction is important because one thing you have to understand about it, say with Hegel, is that Hegel thought that nominalism was a problem because it anthropomorphized truth. In other words, it made a bad humanism out of truth. In other words, it just sort of said, well, truth is reducible to sophism. And sophism is this idea that Socrates encountered, which is kind of like Socrates went around to all of these different communities and each community would have a philosopher, and their philosopher would be like, I'm the representative of my community's truth. And Socrates would sort of perform his Socratic operation and reveal the hollowness of each communities, precisely because they don't have access to something universal. And so I think that perhaps this realism, nominalism thing is quite compelling. And I wonder what Taymiyyah would be linking his nominalism, the validity of his nominalism to. It's been a while since I read Anjum's book, which is a beautiful book, of course.
Yeah. I think, just, again, not to speak on behalf of Ibn Taymiyyah, but just, I think the way out would be, I think on the one hand, the nominalism is almost speaking to a kind of humility on the part of like recognizing that humans are limited and they can only, they each represent themselves in a sense, but I think that is tempered through the community, right? Because it's at the end of the day, the ummah collectively that determines truth, essentially, or truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
The ummah collectively cannot be misguided, right? Like they will not agree upon misguidance, right? There's this hadith which kind of links it. So therefore, that's what tempers it. That's what gets you out of this, like, my truth kind of claims, right? It's like, no, collectively there's going to be a modicum of consensus over something, and it's definitely, whatever it is, it's not going to be something completely outrageous.
That's right. It goes back to the
it's actually grounded in a sort of democracy to begin with.
Exactly.
Right?
It's consensus. It's grounded in consensus of the ummah. That's beautiful. So look, this is something for us to further examine, but it's I had a feeling that you would like that problematic raised in the book, and I'm happy about that.
Good.
So we only have about 10-15 minutes left. So, Mohammed, do you have any other questions before I jump in, or maybe you want to ask about Bonapartism?
So yeah, what do you think, Riyad? Bonapartism or the academics thing, the intellectual thing?
I'd love to hear both. So if we can condense them, yeah, and you can go ahead and ask both, actually, since
okay.
In the interest of time.
Okay, so look, this one it's hopefully a brief one. So another key concept that you propose to help us understand Nietzsche's politics is Bonapartism. So could you please talk a little bit about what this concept is, why it's important for understanding Nietzsche's project and his politics, and for understanding politics today?
Sure. Well, it obviously comes from Napoleon Bonaparte, and it kind of has a touchstone point, as we've been mentioning, in the French Revolution. Now, the idea is that the thrust of the revolution found its stopping point, and therefore its kind of representation in civil society, in Napoleon Bonaparte. So Bonaparte becomes the figure who sort of halts the revolutionary movement and instantiates it in ultimately, what is a kind of reactionary social order. Now, Karl Marx has developed this really interesting idea of what he calls Bonapartism. It's one of the coolest things about Marx, actually. It's one of his best essays. If anybody has never read Marx, I would just recommend you read this essay. It's called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And it's about a distant cousin of Napoleon Bonaparte coming into power. So you can kind of think about this like in the future, like how horrific it might be if like Baron Trump became president. Like, that's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
And so what Marx argued, and this is where Marx famously says that the social order appears first as tragedy, then as farce. So it's a theory about the historical repetition of what? Of the bourgeois social order, of capitalist social order. So it's a class theory. And ultimately, it's a theory about how the bourgeois social order stabilizes itself. Because again, that was Bonaparte's role, is to sort of stop the revolution and sort of finish it, to establish it. He established, in some cases, things that are somewhat interesting and noble, like the modern school system is a Bonapartist contribution, for example. The bureaucracy, it kind of comes out of Bonapartism. And so Bonapartism is this logic whereby how the ruling class deals with crisis of its own legitimacy, okay? So there are Bonapartist figures and there are non-Bonapartist figures. So let's give a couple examples. In Marxism, you could say, for example, that a Bonapartist figure is one who emerges typically outside of the two dominant bourgeois parties, right and left. So, like, what's an example of that? FDR, from an aristocratic family who basically comes in to satiate the crisis of capitalism, not necessarily on the side of socialism. People think he's socialistic because Bernie Sanders says so, but that's not true. He's from an aristocratic family, and he kind of came in to make a compromise between the progressives and the socialists to save the crisis of the system. Donald Trump himself is a Bonapartist, definitely from outside the two capitalist parties, and he emerges at a moment in which the Republican Party was sort of collapsing in upon itself between this Tea Party wing and the neoconservative wing. He organized something completely new. So that's sort of what the Bonapartist does. We may see the Democrats produce a Bonapartist in the future, right? They need one. Right? They're certainly in a legitimacy crisis. So Nietzsche dealt with one of the first German Bonapartists, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was compelling to Nietzsche because socialism was such a live wire threat in Germany at the time that Bismarck created these things called, the anti-socialist laws, and he really stamped down on the left. And Nietzsche admired him because of that, because he was a great stabilizer, right? A great stabilizer. That's what the Bonapartist does. But they're paradoxical because they stabilize by creating these weird cross-class alliances to stabilize the social order. Okay, there's a lot more that can be said, but that's the basic idea.
Right. So yeah, I mean, just following on from that, they like you said, they come in a moment of crisis from typically outside the two-party system to resolve a crisis by kind of reasserting the status quo. But so you make a distinction between, on the one hand, soft Bonapartists who quells socialist demands by delivering progressive concessions, as in the case of FDR, and a hard Bonapartist who aligns with reactionary conservative demands, as in the case of, let's say, Mussolini.
Correct.
And you state that Gramsci considers the hard Bonapartist leader to be synonymous with the fascist leader, but then also acknowledge that, there are some contemporary leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro who are indeed hard Bonapartist figures, but you said they don't qualify as fascists. Could you explain why you make that qualification?
Yes. It's a mercurial distinction, but I think Bonapartism is a theory when you... See, one of the cool things about Marxism, right, is that Marx wrote this essay I just mentioned about Bonapartism, but then subsequent Marxists have built the theory up. And so they've added new dimensions to it. You mentioned Gramsci. There's a lot of people that have added elements to the Bonapartist theory, which are kind of supplements. And one of the supplements that Gramsci adds is a way to understand the Bonapartist as kind of a pre-fascist thinker who is not what he calls Caesarist, precisely because they are constrained by the forces and the mechanisms of liberal bureaucracy that structurally prevent them from being fully dictatorial. And so I think, for example, like we're even seeing this now with Trump, all of these measures that appear very extreme, firing, hundreds of civil servants and government employees, the, various liberal judges are rescinding that, right? So it may appear very extreme in part to please his base, but when push comes to shove, how much will he really be able to destroy? Because the mechanisms won't, right, of bourgeois liberal democracy won't allow it fully to be destroyed. The Caesarist would be a figure who would be content to circumvent those mechanisms entirely. And that's how you would have to tell the difference between them. I think a lot of liberals have done a disservice by basically saying that hard Bonapartist is fascist, when I don't really see the grounds for that accusation. Because they're still constrained by the system, willingly, in most cases, right? it's a spectacle mostly for Trump. It's very difficult to tell the difference between a spectacle and not.
So shifting gears somewhat to see if I can ask this question. So in your discussion of leisure time, you note that the mark that distinguishes the academic intellectual from the laborer or worker is free time. Historically, academic scholarly production has tended to closely align with Nietzsche's goal of gatekeeping and restricting scholarly leisure time to that particular class. Arguably, this tendency persists even in economically precarious academic workers, such as adjunct professors, especially post-2008. However, what we find is that even academics in more stable positions, such as tenure, have tended to recently frame themselves as working class. Would you say that such an identification is tenable by considering markers such as income, or is there something completely wrong-headed about trying to define class on the basis of income, when there are these other factors to consider, such as the nature of labor in question, including affording the scholar kind of leisure time to conduct their research and work, to say nothing of being inducted into this intellectual class?
Good question. Marxism has a strength, which is that it doesn't abide by a liberal definition of class vis-a-vis things like income or rather, the Marxist definition of class will see the worker as that figure who is reliant for their subsistence on wage labor, and that opens up in a certain way, or could open up, a far wider definition of the worker, even inclusive of the salaried worker. So the salaried worker could still qualify in a certain sense, and moreover, we have to be careful because some of this is about labor union struggles where there's a rhetorical choice on behalf of professors to identify with the name of worker for labor rights, which I think is something that I am fully in support of. At the same time, I also see some limitations in the Marxist sort of like, let's say, loose and broad theory of what qualifies as worker. I definitely see some limitations precisely because of this notion of what you intimate there, a prestige economy, and the way that certain forms of gift exchange function. So I would have to incorporate extra Marxist class analysis to really get at a proper understanding of the class experience and class position of the professor. We also have to contend, Mohammed, with a new and frankly, very popular theorization of professionals as a class, which is the professional managerial class theory, which I work with in the book, by the way. So I have some affinities to it. Marx famously said that professionals do not qualify as a class because for Marx, a class is defined in relationship to mode of production and in relationship to means of production, and that professionals are engaged with a different type of the reproduction of value that is not tied to productive labor. What Marx is primarily concerned with in the capitalism of his time is the centrality of productive labor, which he sees as the nucleus of the system. And Marx is a revolutionary, and so he's interested in identifying the class formation that can overcome the system. Professionals in a certain way have a very particular role, which is that they have the role of maintaining the capitalist system at the level of what Marx called the superstructure. The culture, the value sphere, all of that means that in some ways the professional is given a type of choice of solidarity. They're kind of on the border of solidarity. A lot of Marxist authors talk about how they become petty bourgeois, which means they're lower bourgeois. And the petty bourgeois is a contradictory position because they can sort of choose to be with the worker or with the bourgeoisie. And that's why you have a lot of class consciousness amongst professionals, because they're torn. They're torn about whose allegiance they should have. And moreover, like, how do we even forge an allegiance with workers, quote unquote? So it becomes very mercurial. In the case of adjuncts, it's very obvious that they are workers. In some cases, they're almost lumpenized, meaning that they're sort of discarded entirely from secure wages. So not only are they reliant on wages, they're on the margins of even having that reliance itself. So their precarity is very profound. So I suppose from a Marxist standpoint, it's a bit, a lot of supplements need to be added to Marx because we no longer have a productive proletariat. I was just doing an interview on my podcast with Jody Dean, and the numbers show that by far the working class is service sector oriented, by far. So this notion of a productive proletariat that Marx encountered, things are a lot different now. And I think we got to keep those things into consideration.
Okay, we're out of time, but I'm glad we had enough time to raise that question about leisure and labor. Daniel, thank you. We'll have to have you back on to continue the discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on. Really enjoyed it.
And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions at proteanview@muftah.org. Whether you're tuning in on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, we'd appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of the show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org/protean-view for more information on our upcoming episodes, and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.